Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to Meridian Online. This is Stuart Holliday, the CEO of Meridian International Center in Washington, D.C., and we're delighted that you are joining us for today's program, looking at U.S.-European cooperation, broadly speaking, but more specifically as we look at the need to address China and the potential competition there, and the need for the United States and Europe to really underpin and reinforce our shared values and shared commitment to democracy and free trade and a rules-based order. And we have a great program for you today with Congressman Darin LaHood and member of the European Parliament, Reinhard Bütikofer. And he and Darin both play leadership roles in strengthening that relationship. And I'm also very pleased that this program is a partnership with the European Parliament Liaison Office here in Washington, and is the third in our One Atlantic series with them, looking at the issues of transatlantic cooperation and strengthening our ties with the EU. And it's very timely, I believe, to have this discussion. And we couldn't do it without the support of our private sector partners. And I'd like to thank Michelle Matthey from Otsuka, which you'll hear a little bit more about from her. But I want to turn it over to kick us off to Joe Dunn, who is the head of the European Parliament Liaison Office here in Washington, and is a great partner of Meridian, has an extensive background in policy issues, and has served as a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and has experience in the broad range of institutions, including the Irish Foreign Ministry. So Joe, welcome, and thank you for being here today. And I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Ambassador Holliday. It's great to be working in partnership with you to deepen the conversation and the dialogue between the European Parliament and the US Congress. That's what we're here for. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce the chairman of our European Parliament delegation to China, Mr. Reinhard Bütikofer. Mr. Bütikofer is a great expert on China, as well as being a keen student of the United States, which he has visited regularly for many years, perhaps even decades. I'm not quite sure. Reinhard can put us straight on that. Reinhard is also a member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, and he has the distinction, I think I can say, of having been singled out by the Chinese Communist Party for sanctions earlier this year in May, one of only 5 MEPs to wear this badge of honor, as it were, showing that he is a champion of democracy for that large country. So I think that there are few people better qualified to talk with Congressman LaHood on, I think, one of the major issues of our concern in our time, certainly a major issue for EU-US relations. You know, how can we, European Union and United States, or can we even cooperate with China in the economic field, in the technology field, and in security and defense? So over to you, Mr. Bütikofer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Mr. Dunn. And I also want to thank you and Ambassador Holliday and Meridian for putting on this event. I think it's great that we can in this way contribute to, as you say, strengthening the transatlantic relationship also between the European Parliament and Congress. And I'm particularly pleased to meet again my good friend, Congressman LaHood. Unfortunately, Congressman, I think we've been meeting more online than physically. We should find a way of changing that in the future. This debate comes at a perfect time. It could hardly be placed more fittingly, because today we celebrate in Germany the swearing in of the new German government. And then tomorrow and the day thereafter, we will attend from afar. Probably most of us will not be immediately involved, but we will attend the proceedings of President Biden's Democracy Summit. And in both dimensions, China does play a role. The new German government is, as you certainly have heard, of tripartite competition, complexion. It's led by a social democratic chancellor, and it includes the Free Democrats and my own Green Party also. And my party co-president, Annalena Baerbock, will be the new German foreign minister. One of the first public conversations about the foreign policy dimension of the work that this government sets out to do has been about China. Because I dare say that this government is pursuing a paradigm shift with regard to Germany's China policy. We are promising that we will pursue a more European approach, united European approach. We're also explicitly stating the interest of having strong coordination across the Atlantic with our American partners on China, and also working with like-minded countries worldwide. We, of course, say, as have previous governments of Germany, that we want to cooperate with China wherever possible, but we clearly state that this should be done on the basis of human rights and international law, not cooperation for cooperation's sake, but cooperation in a certain framework. Also, we don't shy back from raising issues that are critical, where we are not at all willing to mince words about the practices in China, like the terrible human rights violations in Xinjiang. It's being addressed by the new government. We also raise the case of Hong Kong and the breach of international law that Beijing has decided to go for in that context. We also mentioned Taiwan, and this is novel. I don't think that there have been any European governments over the last couple of years that did address Taiwan in such a prominent way. We do say, and this is meant to be a contribution to a more intense discussion about the future and the role of Taiwan, we do say that the relations across this Taiwan Strait should be developed in a peaceful way, not coercing one side, and that we would also want to support strongly the meaningful participation of the democratic Taiwan in international organizations. This is in line with the position that the European Parliament has been taking in recent times with overwhelming majorities. We voted a resolution on Taiwan with the support of the 5 major democratic groups, and we had 580 votes in favor and just 26 opposed. So the new German government will give a new thrust to its own and to Europe's China policy, but obviously China policy has to play out on many different fronts. For instance, the fact that the United States and the EU are now working together in the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, that is also connected to concerns that we share about the role of China. The fact that we're both trying to deal with the necessities of WTO reform has, of course, to do with the role that China plays in economic relations. President Biden has pronounced his Build Back Better World initiative, building on the Blue Dot Network initiative that President Trump originated. We have just set out as a European Union to promote our own global gateway initiative with a 300 billion euro for infrastructure investment, focusing in particular on digital infrastructure and clean tech infrastructure. I believe that in all these dimensions, there is a lot of scope for collaboration. China is not happy to see that there is an increasing level of cooperation between the US and the EU. It's been an obvious goal of the Xi leadership to drive a wedge between transatlantic partners, and the way in which they pursued the comprehensive agreement on investment that was finalized end of last year gives testimony to that analysis. But as we speak, the comprehensive agreement on investment has been put into the deep freezer by the European Parliament as our answer to the sanctions that China imposed in retaliation for our human rights policy. As Mr. Dunn said, we're not going to take that lying down. So we stood up to those terrible practices. And when China reacted by sweeping, hard-hitting sanctions, basically what they did, they shot themselves in the foot. And I think they're beginning to realize, but they're not willing to concede that. So the China policy from the European side will continue to be multifaceted. There will be systemic rivalry, there will be competition, there will be, if could be realized, cooperation. And I'm happy to see that there is a similar understanding on the other side of the pond. So I would invest a lot of hope into the efforts from either side to move more closely together and to be very effective. One last sentence here. I don't think that we should let ourselves be misled into pursuing an anti-China policy. Even though China is a systemic rival, just reacting to what they do and what they scheme would not be sufficient to develop our own wider perspectives. We should pursue a positive agenda that describes the kind of responsibility that we want to carry in the international relations, where we want to partner with nations around the globe. And I hope that living on the basis and working on the basis of shared ideals, I hope that the transatlantic relationship can also be given new energy and new vigor by this cooperation. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Reinhard. It's nice to see you, and we hope to see you in person. I appreciate your remarks. I'd now like to turn it over to Michelle Matthew with Otsuka, which is a fascinating company on the cutting edge of pharmaceuticals, medicine, technology, and in Japan does a lot of other things. But Michelle, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our distinguished guest, the Congressman.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Otsuka is a global health solutions company that employs approximately 4,000 people across 195 companies in 31 countries. We're currently celebrating our centennial. Here in the US, we research, develop, manufacture, and market innovative products with a focus on high unmet medical need in the challenging areas of serious mental illness and kidney health. We are one of the only pharmaceutical companies that continues to invest in developing pharmaceuticals, digital medicine, and digital therapeutics for the treatment of mental illness. It is my honor to introduce Congressman Darin LaHood today from the great state of Illinois, which I am a bit partial to, having also hailed from there. He is a third-generation Peorian. Mr. LaHood represents his hometown as part of Illinois' 18th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Mr. LaHood is in good company representing Illinois' 18th because it is also known as the Lincoln District due to President Abraham Lincoln representing the area during his tenure in Congress. Congressman LaHood's ties to our nation's history does not end there. He currently serves on the House's oldest committee, Ways and Means. The Ways and Means Committee has jurisdiction over all taxation, trade, and tariffs, and other revenue-raising measures. As part of his committee work, he serves on subcommittees on tax policy and trade. In March of this year, Mr. LaHood was appointed to serve on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. The committee oversees the nation's intelligence agencies. Congressman LaHood also serves on the House Democracy Partnership. He currently co-chairs the U.S.-China Working Group, the U.S.-Brazil Caucus, the Digital Trade Caucus, the U.S.-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, and the Congressional Soccer Caucus. Congressman LaHood and his wife, Kristen, are the proud parents of 3 sons, McKay, Lucas, and Teddy, whom they love to watch play soccer. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Darin LaHood.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Great to see you. Appreciate your friendship and that very nice introduction. And let me just acknowledge Meridian International Center for organizing this today. And your leadership, Ambassador Holliday, and all the good folks at Meridian for continuing to put together programs like this that encourage dialogue with our folks today in the EU, but all over the world. So grateful for Meridian. And let me acknowledge Reinhard. Yes, we need to get back in person, Reinhard. I know we've met in my office here in DC, but we've been on a number of Zoom calls together. Thanks for your leadership in the European Parliament and your continued advocacy on many of these important issues. And today is a great opportunity to talk about that transatlantic partnership and relationship and continuing to build on that as it relates to China, both on the economic front and the security front and the technology front, which are all very, very important. So happy to be on today. And as Michelle mentioned, I serve as the co-chair of the U.S.-China Working Group in the House of Representatives, which is a bipartisan group. And then I also serve on the China Task Force, which is a Republican task force that has been meeting. And we recently put out a summary of proposals on how we work to counteract China and many of the issues related to China. Lots of topics that we can talk about in terms of partnership. And so this dialogue here today and discussion is important. Well, I think the U.S. and EU face tremendous challenges to address Chinese actions in trade, national security, and the technology spaces. I think there's also opportunities for obviously the U.S. and the EU and our other like-minded allies to support each other in countering China, creating high global standards and working to ensure China is pressured to play by the rules in the global stage arena. In the U.S., there is a bipartisan agreement that China's predatory trade policies, including forced labor, IP theft, forced technology transfers, and massive subsidies, and the excess capacity are unacceptable and harming not only American businesses, but the global business economy and workers. As we continue to look for opportunities for cooperation, I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will work with our allies, particularly at the World Trade Organization, including our EU countries, and throughout the Indo-Pacific region to counter the effects of China's trade-distorting industrial policies. This includes clarifying the scope of existing trade rules that prohibit China's industrial subsidies and negotiating new trade agreements to counter China's coercive policies. Prompt renewal of GSP and MTB can provide important short-term opportunities to strengthen our economy and diversify sourcing that is overly dependent on China. And we saw that in particular during the pandemic over the last 2 years, a heavy reliance many of the core products that were part of the pandemic recovery. I continue to believe that we must look at issues related to China in a strong, coordinated, and pragmatic manner. The national security and economic interests of the U.S. and EU remain significant. And I'm glad that we are able to have these conversations like today to continue to engage with one another and encourage additional knowledge sharing between our allies. I would also mention that as we deal with these topics, a couple things. One, we're actually going to be voting today on the House floor on a bill to highlight forced labor, particularly the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. This is a bill that the Chinese are really apoplectic about in terms of us continuing to raise these issues. But it's important from a human rights standpoint to continue to talk about what's going on in Xinjiang. And so we'll be voting on that, and I'll be supporting that today on the floor. Secondarily, I have mentioned this before in other formats as it relates to China. There has really been a coalescing of political philosophies in the Congress as it relates to China. You go back some years ago, and I would say there were kind of multiple camps that were anti-China. You had the economic hawks, you had trade hawks, you had human rights hawks. They've all kind of found each other now in a coordinated, approach when it comes to China. So I've been a bit frustrated as we've seen the Biden administration. Now we're almost 11 months into the administration, and we haven't had a kind of a roadmap or a vision for what we're going to do in the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly with China on trade. I again been frustrated with our USTR trade ambassador, Ambassador Tai, who I know well. She worked on the Ways and Means Committee, but I think there's a collective frustration that we haven't seen a strong, a robust, rules-based agenda coming out of the Biden administration as it relates to trade and what we can be doing differently. I will say this: I know that President Biden earlier in the summer was in Europe and talked about digital trade and working with our European allies, again, on a rules-based system as it relates to digital trade. I think that's vitally important moving forward. And partnering with our like-minded allies in a multilateral approach is something I don't think we've done enough of. And of course, what we hear from President Xi and the Chinese, government is that, they like to espouse that and disparage democracy, that, democracy, it's too hard to reach consensus in democracies, and really to disparage that to benefit them and at the expense, again, of democracies and our like-minded allies. And we got to remember that as we continue to move forward. So I think it's important that we show that we can govern in a multilateral approach and partner with our allies on some of these core issues. The last point that I would make just domestically here is that, there are many in the Congress that want to go to a Cold War mentality as it relates to China. And I would just make a couple points on that. One, I don't believe China today is what Russia was 35 years ago. It is a different dynamic in terms of what we have today with China. I mean, we are intertwined economically, much more so with China than we ever were with Russia. A middle class of 600 million in China is something that our producers and companies can't ignore. And of course, Russia had a much more expansionary vision when we were in the Cold War with them. So I don't necessarily think it is applicable to think about them in a Cold War mentality, but it is something that we continue to see when we think about decoupling, when we think about offshoring, and what that means and how that looks to the future. But we are going to have to continue to deal with, and I would say on both sides of the aisle, we've seen this Cold War mentality. People have had enough with China continuing to rip us off when it comes to intellectual property, forced technology transfers, a number of these core issues, and blatantly stealing from the United States. And China, I believe, has not given the best answers or the best responses on that. And so we're left with, again, a push for Cold War proposals and policies through the Congress. So but with that, Ambassador Holliday, happy to engage in questions or comments that you or the audience may have. And it's a real pleasure to be with everybody today. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. And I think we'll get Reinhard back as well. Yes, welcome back. You know, it is worth noting when you both sort of compared or used the Cold War, you know, as an analogy, that one of the things that we were able to do with Europe was really understand Russia. I mean, really study Russia. Really, there were generations of students that went PhDs in understanding, you know, Kremlinology and Russia. And I just hope that as we formulate in both of our areas, Europe and the US, that we develop a cadre of experts and young people who really get to understand China and the Chinese people, because I think that's critical. We don't want to make policy in a vacuum, especially if we're trying to play a nuanced approach of competing on some things, challenging on other areas, and then even in some cases dealing with containment on a military basis. So it's going to take a lot of very, I think, good diplomacy, but also very good relationships and research. So I just wanted to point that out. Sorry for pontificating about that, but I wanted to ask you all both a question about, you know, we have this dialogue and you all have been leaders in it of standing up for our shared values and looking at the question. Have you all noticed a shift in the views of the private sector in recent years? Obviously, it used to be that the government would say one thing and then the private sector would have its overwhelming interests at trying to maintain those market access points. But what role do they play, and how do we both protect them but have them shore up the strategy that you all are developing? I guess Reinhard first, and then Congressman.
Okay, great question, Ambassador. I will delve right into that. But before I do that, I wanna say I cannot agree more with what you said about acquiring enough Asia and China competency. And if we're frank with each other, at least I would say for my own country that we haven't invested enough in that regard. And we have to do that to understand better what we're up against or where possibly also the opportunities may lie. And I also agree completely with the Congressman that we should not fall into the trap of a Cold War mentality. This is a new kind of game. This is a new kind of approach that we will need. But going to your question about the private sector, it is interesting in Germany in particular that the more recent development of a increasingly critical attitude towards China was led by the private sector. It was the German Federation of Industry, BDI, that in January 2019 published a strategic study about China relations with a very critical perspective, identifying also the kind of homework they said we would have to do to continue being competitive and dealing with the challenges. And that gave rise to a wider conversation. At the time, that was a relatively lonely voice from the business community. That has changed. The Business Europe Association, which brings together the industry associations from all the European countries, followed suit with a similar paper a year later, beginning 2020. Some very important industrial associations in Germany, like the engineering industry, the electrical industry, have also moved in that direction. There's still some other voices. You would hear some voices from big multinational corporations like Volkswagen or Siemens that would still sing the praise of the win-win approach. I'm not sure they believe it really, but frankly, they have put too many eggs into that one Chinese basket, and now they are afraid somebody will trample them. But the overall attitude is much more critical, and I can echo what the congressman said about coalescing communities. In Germany also, we used to have the business community, the human rights community, the national security community. They've never been closer together on China than they are today. And that creates the strength of the policy outlook, because this is not just something that the government may want to do or not want to do. This is something that resonates broadly within our societies, including the business community. And the president of the German Federation of Industry, for instance, said publicly that there are ethical limits to what European companies should do. And he mentioned explicitly banning the importation of products of forced labor, banning forced labor. And he was chided for that by the ultra-nationalist Global Times in China, given names by the Chinese for taking that attitude, but clearly shows that we are now moving. And on the European front also, I think it's relevant that there is more consensus than there has been over the last 10 years with regard to some trade defense instruments. So we just today, the European Commission published a strategy paper on an anti-coercion instrument, looking at the experience that Australia has made or that Lithuania is making at the moment. So how can we band together to push back against such use of economic relations, such weaponizing of economic relations by China? And in that regard, I think the business community is a strong supporter for a very responsible China policy.
Sorry, thank you, Reinhard. Congressman?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ambassador. I would say, just to follow up on Reinhard, a couple things. When we think about the private sector and we think about, businesses, I mean, I think it's really bifurcated in a lot of ways. And what do I mean by that? I think the multinational corporations that have been in China for 30, 50 years have a different mentality when it comes to China and how we should be treating China than, for instance, the technology companies. And obviously, we lead the world in technology, but the rules that China establishes for our tech companies are completely different than the multinational corporations. I'll give you an example. I represent the largest concentration of Caterpillar workers anywhere in the world, and proud to represent them. Caterpillar has 29 manufacturing plants in China, 4 R&D facilities. They've been there for 40 years. They are well established. And you can replicate that with probably the top 100 multinational corporations, many of them based in the US. And so they want to keep the status quo going with China. And so when there is criticism, it's interesting how China has used that for leverage, right? Through the, and these are organizations that I work with often, the BRT, the Chamber of Commerce. But they are embedded in a lot of ways with the CCP and what President Xi and China are doing. And that's part of the problem, to be honest with you, Stuart, is that they don't want change. They don't want disruption because they are in the marketplace and have the relationship. But it's completely different when you look at our tech companies and what happens when they go over. And listen, we lead the world. We have the best technology companies anywhere. But when they try to establish a foothold in China, it is completely different. They want to know how you built your cloud services. They want to know everything that went into the intellectual property that built that. They want the force technology transfers. They want the cross-border data flows that they have access to. And by the way, this doesn't happen in any other industrialized country but for China. And so, there is a difference that is distinct there. But again, this gets back to how China plays by a different set of rules and continues to do that because they think they can. And I think there has to be ramifications for that of having kind of two sets of rules there. So It gets back to part of the problem when we think about what is the solution and what we do. You get a lot of pushback when we look at CFIUS and how we make that stronger. We look at more transparency in our markets, in how these Chinese companies are set up. How much are they subsidized? I mean, that transparency, again, that you have in global markets, whether it's in the US or whether it's in Germany or whether it's throughout Europe, again, a different set of rules, and it's the resistance to that from China is palpable.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And, one of the interesting thoughts would be whether, and I'm not sure what the mechanism is, but for companies to rally around basically a common set of conditions under which, not mandated by necessarily by regulation, but where they say, look, we won't do business if we have to turn over this critical technology in this country. We won't do business but to say we'd like to do business there if those conditions were met, and have some sort of umbrella. I don't know how you do that, but I wanted to bring Michelle back in, and I believe she's got a question. I'd encourage anybody to use the Q&A function on your chat, or the Q&A function rather on your Zoom to ask a question. We welcome all questions, either by attribution or anonymously. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. You both mentioned digital trade in your last comments. I was wondering, as a global company on the forefront of digital medicine, I was just hoping you could expand on how to best further digital trade, not just between the US and the EU, but China as well.
Anybody want to take that first?
Yeah, I'll just start off. Thank you, Michelle, for the question. It's an important one. And I would just say, I mentioned earlier, the recent establishment of the US-EU Trade Technology Council, I think, is a very good start, which really serves as a forum to seek closer ties on a variety of tech issues and work to strengthen that global cooperation when it comes to technology and digital and supply chain. So again, I think it's great to establish that and to kind of work on that. But there is no doubt there are global trade challenges when it comes to digital. We're dealing with that a little bit with DSTs right now, a little bit of a separate issue, but it shows the complexity and the nuances these technology issues are from country to country. I will also say, Michelle, if you look at the digital trade chapter or chapters within USMCA, which obviously we got agreement with the Canadians and the Mexicans, I think it's kind of the gold standard for what we ought to use. I think it is a fair standard to use to do that, but we ought to look at how we put that in place. And by the way, since it's been implemented, it's working fairly well, but it helps to protect intellectual property, those cross-border data flows, and kind of uniformly puts in place rules of the road when it comes to technology. And so it's going to take some work, but as I mentioned, the council that was put together with the EU, I think, is an important first step. Now we have to build upon that.
I would add that we have to do two things at the same time. We have to play offense and we have to play defense. Playing defense means addressing the fact that, for instance, China is now mandating that all the data that are created in China have to be stored in China, and they can only be exported if there's an explicit go-ahead by the Chinese government. This puts a lot of pressure economically on small and medium-sized enterprises that want to invest in China, but they don't want to run two data management systems, one at home and one in China. It's a cost factor, but it's also an intrusive factor, because you cannot, if you work on autonomous driving, for instance, and collect some experience in China, you cannot readily re-export those data, that experience, to your company at home. That kind of stuff we have to address. That's what I mean when I say playing defense. But we also have to play offense and partner with other countries. We are thinking about partnering with countries like India that have a strong IT sector, partnering with countries also in Africa, where we should help providing IT and digital infrastructure in order to give those countries an alternative to what the Chinese are offering. Because if we don't offer alternatives, they might feel themselves forced to go for what they get. And that China is using its so-called Belt and Road strategy to create dependencies, that's obvious. So I think these digital partnerships should be a very important part of the game.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask you each a question, unrelated question, starting with Congressman, but I'll ask them at once so that you can have a chance to think about it. The first one is, Congressman, you introduced last week a U.S. trade leadership in the Indo-Pacific and China Act, and I was wondering if you could share with our audience a little bit about what's in there and what you were hoping to achieve. And then for Reinhard, we had Deputy National Security Advisor yesterday at Meridian talking a little bit about the effort to kind of remove some of the irritants in the relationship with the EU that had been in place, whether it was some of the trade disputes, the Airbus issue, the whiskey and bourbon tariffs, all of this stuff. I was interested in your view about how far along that pendulum back to basically normal noise in the relationship that you have with anyone, moving from what you would call distracting or impeding noise that actually prevents cooperation on issues, other issues that we're trying to work on together. So Congressman, maybe I'll turn it over to you first to talk about your bill.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ambassador. Yes, we introduced a bill last week, Congresswoman Carol Miller and myself, HR 6114. You referenced the title, the U.S. Trade Leadership in the Indo-Pacific and China Act. And this really grew out of what I referenced earlier, the fact that the Biden administration really hasn't laid out a roadmap or a plan when it comes to trade. And let's remember, we haven't touched on it today, Stuart, but we're still under the phase one obligations with China, which was under the last administration was an agreement with China on phase one. And there's still largely a purchasing agreement, but there were also a number of other provisions in there. And so those purchase obligations are still ongoing. But moving into the Biden administration, there hasn't been a clear denunciation of where they want to go. So our bill does a couple things. It supports TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, which we think is essential for a robust trade policy moving forward. It encourages a rules-based system with our like-minded allies in the region and the Indo-Pacific region. It encourages, again, building off the digital trade pact that Singapore and New Zealand and Australia have also engaged in. It also, we've been, again, a bit frustrated with USTR. And so we have a number of reporting requirements that we ask USTR to be on. For instance, we asked them to articulate and identify the long-term trade economic plan with China that details our progress in combating China's coercive economic practices. We asked for a comprehensive assessment of the Section 301 tariffs that are in place, which are controversial a bit. Those were put in place at a time when we were in a bit of a trade war. It seems like they're now more detrimental than ever before, those tariffs. I'm generally not a fan of tariffs. And so we've asked for some clarification on where that's at. And then also, we look at combating China's forced technology transfers and intellectual property theft, a complete scorecard on China's compliance with its phase one commitments, and then a listing of new enforcement tools that will require China to make further structural reforms. And so those are a few of the things that we ask USTR to get back with us on. And so, again, I think it's kind of a marker that we put out there of where we think this negotiation or our trade policy with China, the Indo-Pacific region, needs to go. And we've been very proud of a number of co-sponsors. I think almost every Republican on the Ways and Means Committee. So that's where we start. And again, looking for the Biden administration to be engaged and work with us as we move forward.
Thank you. And it certainly is important to fill the vacuum left after TPP efforts were halted, and very, very important. And thanks to the legislative branch for helping shore us up until the executive figures out its program, which I'm sure they will do.
That's correct.
Reinhard.
Ambassador, if you allow me to make a remark with tongue in cheek, sorry, I would say to some degree the European Union has tried filling the void by concluding free trade agreements with a number of partners that you might have had in the TPP if you had not run from it. But moving to your question, Ambassador, there has been some positive efforts to remove old standing trade irritants, like the ceasefire in the Airbus-Boeing case. But by far, this is not moving fast enough, far enough. The congressman just spoke about the detrimental effects of tariffs. I agree with that. I'm not a friend of tariffs, but we have seen tariffs levied on European steel and aluminum that we also consider not only detrimental, but also illegal under WTO law. And even though there is a ceasefire now, it's not been removed, and that is not overly helpful. There is a case that was just decided a few days ago by the WTO about the exportation of Spanish olives to the US market, and the European Union won the case at the WTO. Now the question will be, and this will be watched closely around Europe, will the US go along with that decision, or will you appeal into the void because there is no appellate body at the time? And of course, you can basically render such a decision moot by appealing into the void. What is going to be the attitude of the administration? I don't know. And there is, I must confess, there is some suspicion around Europe vis-a-vis what the Biden team calls the trade policy for the middle class, because many of us believe that this is heavily imbued with protectionist notions, which we're not great friends of. But I would concede that Trade Representative Tai has taken some positive steps as far as we're concerned, but we would want to see that going much further. One issue that created quite some concern around Europe, to add that, was the AUKUS deal that was done between the UK, the Australians, and the US recently. I'm not questioning the purpose of the AUKUS deal, but the way in which it was conducted, the way in which it was managed, did much harm to the perspective of transatlantic cooperation. You should consult with allies, to say the least.
Thank you, Reinhard. Well, I hope we don't let a few olives come between us. But I did want to end with one quick question. The president spoke yesterday with Vladimir Putin about the situation in Ukraine, and I think laid out very forcefully that there would be a response, sanctions response, if there was action. I guess a question for congressmen is that the right approach in your view? And then Reinhard, do you actually think that this is a real preparation for a military operation, or merely a big show or a way to get leverage to try to get Ukraine to back off on getting closer to the West?
Well, Stuart, a couple observations. One, I think this is more than saber rattling by Putin. When you look at upwards to 150 to 175,000 Russian troops on the border, active war games going on, this is serious. And I think that was reflected by the call yesterday, and then the follow-up call that the president had with our European allies. So I think, obviously the ball is in Putin's court to decide what to do. But, this gets down to fundamental, issues of how strong NATO is and pushing the EU and what we're going to do. On the pragmatic side, though, I worry about, militarily what will happen if there is an invasion. I'm not sure there's, I know we've been arming the Ukrainians, and I know that we've supplied them with a number of things, but I still worry that there's the response from the U.S. or NATO may not be able to equal what Putin's going to do there. The other thought is this is a negotiating strategy, that this is Putin using his leverage in some way to send a message that Ukraine will never be part of NATO or the EU. And this is a forceful way of doing that. I also have to wonder that would this be going on if we had not had such a debacle in Afghanistan? It was, I believe, an epic failure of leadership, and I don't say that lightly, in terms of what occurred there, what happened. And I think it showed weakness on the United States, and I wonder whether Putin would be moving forth if we hadn't had kind of that calamity there. But U.S. strength will be tested here. And listen, I hope that calmer minds will prevail and that Putin will continue to negotiate moving forward. But I think it's totally unpredictable, and I don't know what will transpire. But we need to be ready if and when he does move into Ukraine.
Thank you, Congressman. We just have a couple minutes left. Reinhard, your views.
Well, I consider Putin to be a very strong poker player. He plays his cards well. He's not irrational. If he sees a low risk and a big return, he will go for it. If he sees that he might run into trouble, he will possibly stay back. So it may be saber rattling, and it may be a real plan, and it's not clear yet, not even to him. It depends on what we do. And that's why I believe that deterrence is the name of the game. Militarily, I would argue that probably the Ukrainian army is a better fighting force than the German army is at the moment. So for him, the military risk is already there. That what would cost a lot of Russian mothers their sons if they would go for military aggression. But our role is not in the military dimension. Our role is in the economic and political dimension. And the deterrence means showing him all the tools that we might have, including SWIFT, for instance, to make sure that he understands that there is a will to push back and to defend the stability and the peace in the continent.
Thank you to both of you for joining us today, and I appreciate your leadership on these issues. They're vital at this time, and we hope to continue this dialogue, whether it's in Peoria or Brussels. We'll have are you going to start a nonstop flight from Peoria to Brussels? I think you might need to.
I'm all in.
Good. And I'd like to thank Otsuka and Joe and the European Parliament Liaison Office here in Washington for their partnership. And I hope everybody has a terrific week and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Congressman.
Great to see you, Reinhard. Take care.
Take care. Thank you, Mr.